Tristram Shandy was released onto an unsuspecting literary world between 1757 to 1759 and stretches to 9 decently sized volumes. Now, those two facts alone would have made it a rather challenging read today. Unfortunately, that's the very tip of the iceberg with this novel, because this is a novel that makes fun of everything, including, and most crucially and confusingly, the concept of novels. It's a satire on class, it's a satire on society, it's a satire on the way people speak, and it's a satire on the way people write their memoirs and fiction as a whole. In fact, it's hard even to explain what I mean, but let me try. While some books take a long time to read because they are long, Tristram Shandy, whilst coincidentally being long, and written in that very archaic language, also takes a long time to read because it was designed to take a long time to read. The author has deliberately, and admittedly brilliantly, split what he pretends to be a telling of his memoirs into endless fragments of digressions and anecdotes and sections and passages and letters and stories. James Joyce called the experience of reading Tristram Shandy the layering of planes of narrative in order to create a single aesthetic experience. But in a way, the mere fact that James Joyce loved it so much should probably tell you something. It is the newest addition to my top 5 most difficult to finish books ever, and if you haven't seen my video on how to read the books that are really hard to read, please check it out here. Tristram Shandy is very funny, a novel written by an incredibly clever and quick-witted satirist that must have made it that decade's literary success. Unfortunately, however, it's a style of comedy that was hugely popular a few hundred years ago, and is now, unsurprisingly, more than a little out of fashion. To enjoy it, therefore, whilst not impossible, requires a little bit more effort these days. Mostly, the comedy falls into 2 styles. Clever. Like a lot of novels of this period, the book is at least partially written to show off how intelligent and well-read the author is. Now, this is a comedy, so the whole thing's not quite as unbearable as it is in some novels. Nevertheless, you can expect clever jokes about the sort of things that aren't even commonly taught in schools anymore, like spoof Latin extracts or riffs on ancient Greek mythology. Much like Shakespeare, this is the sort of book that's usually a lot funnier once you've researched it, so it might be worth doing some background reading about the period. Bawdy. Now, plenty of the sort of humour that's in this book would have seemed astonishingly risque back in the 1700s, perhaps even wickedly shocking. This was a book to be read amongst the men in the coffee houses, or shared as a delightful secret between husband and wife in the boudoir. Again, however, much of that style of humour centres around the idea that it simply isn't acceptable to talk about sex or genitalia in any form in polite society, and therefore incorporates a huge number of comic ingenuities to get around the subject. Social mores, however, have changed so much, and we are now so desensitised to sex, that it's possible to miss these jokes entirely. Let me give you a hint. An astonishingly disproportionate amount of the novel is about penises. Whether that's the question of whether Tristram had his penis squashed in a sash window when he was little, actually it was his nose, or if Uncle Toby still has a fully functioning penis after his war injury. There, I just summarised several hundred pages of jokes. Tristram himself is an interesting character. We have to take our impressions of him either from his narrative voice, or from the scenes in which he completely disappears or hasn't been born yet, but other people are talking about him. He's obviously clever, funny, well-educated, and more than a little inclined to waffle. He's also got a tendency to be sentimentally melancholic, he's ruthlessly honest with his audience, and he desperately wants to be taken seriously. Other than that, we don't know that much about him. We hear more about the people, places, transport, and commodities around him than about himself. Uncle Toby is the kindest, gentlest, and most ludicrously modest person you could possibly imagine. Despite supposedly being something of a lion on the battlefield, the man is a kitten off it, if kittens had a paralysingly acute grasp of the social niceties of the 1700s. He also has absolutely no concept of sex, or of the opposite gender whatsoever, which plays into a long sequence of his delicate courting of the widow Wadman. He's also addicted to his toy soldiers, a habit he picked up during a lengthy convalescence as a result of a war wound he sustained in Flanders. That long convalescence is really useful to the story since it took place at Tristram's own house. Probably unfairly, I've lumped Tristram's mother and father together here as a package deal. Although there are many scenes in which they are not together, or perhaps it's fairer to say there are lots of scenes in which Tristram's father appears alone, the scenes in which they are both present do a good job of highlighting their characteristics more starkly. Walter is a philosopher and self-important classicist who takes his own opinions enormously seriously. He's generous, honest, extremely pompous, and a fairly terrible husband, happy to talk over his wife,
constantly irritated with her for her passive disinterest in being educated by him, an idea that in reality he would probably hate, since he seems to strongly believe that women should really know their place. Mrs. Shandy, then, is a sort of nothing figure, a foil to Mr. Shandy, with whom she constantly agrees and never questions, no matter how nonsensical what he says is. She's even a slightly subversive figure, reduced to listening at keyholes to find out her husband's opinion or the latest gossip, or seen conspiring with the other females who occasionally appear in this book. In this, I think she mostly represents the total idiocy of Georgian society at the time. Men had literally no clue what women thought and felt, and often it never occurred to them to ask. Each gender lived in an entirely different world to the other, and saw the other's realm as a shadowy and mysterious place. Better analysts than me have pointed out the major misogyny of the novel and how obviously it fails, for example, the Bechdel test. But I truly believe that this aspect of the book, and specifically Miss Shandy's character, like everything else in the novel, is satire, meant more to show how ridiculous the whole thing is than an earnest representation of what Sterne genuinely thought women were thinking and feeling. Corporal Trim is Uncle Toby's servant. Wonderfully loyal, kind, obstreperous, and just as obsessed with military fortifications as his master, he is an enjoyable character. He does a great job of bridging that upstairs-downstairs gap, acting as a link pin that often shows us what the servants are doing downstairs. In some ways, Trim is a sort of amalgamation of all the upstairs figures added together and then distilled. He is as kind as Uncle Toby, as full of himself as Dr. Slop, as inclined to pontificate as Tristram's father, and as funny as the pastor.
So that's about it. Unusual, experimental, stream of consciousness writing from about 200 years before that became a fashionable thing to do. If I could give you one piece of advice on how to read Tristram Shandy, I would tell you to let the digressions become as real as possible. Because if you try to read it as a straight novel, you'll get a headache. Instead, allow yourself to do what 20th century society has equipped us to do. Get bored, change the format, change the literary voice, forget that you're reading a novel, try to think of it as a series of different articles. When I was reading this, I had the paper version, a Kindle version, 2 audiobooks, and the Steve Coogan film to watch for some light relief. And I don't think I could have got through it any other way. I'd love to know how you got on with it. Thanks for watching.